Okay, so do we have time, I think, for a few questions, or in case anybody that participated in any of the breakout groups feels like something was missing?
I have two comments and a question. The first comment is on the standardization, that the information isn't standardized, which always comes up in these discussions. In his epistemology, Ludwig Wittgenstein stated that really our concepts are not the same, but they generally have family resemblances. So these cousins allow us to communicate, and we do communicate, even though there's fuzziness in terms of the concepts. I don't think that standardization will come unless there's some overpowering reason to do so. So, for example, an example that some of you have heard me make is that the domestic electricity has about 140 years. And 140 years on, we don't have standardization on the plugs. They like them round here, they like them square in the United States. Some places they like them big and chunky with 3 of them. Others like the square at a little angle. So at 140 years, we haven't progressed much on that. But we do connect to the wall everywhere we go. Then the other extreme example is the machine that you put a piece of plastic into, put in 4 digits, and it gives you money anywhere in the world and in seconds. Now, that protocol became so universal that no bank wants to be left out of that, because it would be left out of huge global cash flows, which is very profitable. So there has to be a driver with regard to this. Now, if you really want standardization, make it a module in the national accounts, and IMF will standardize. But be careful what you wish for, because also you say that the IFI templates are heavy, are complex, are time-consuming. So the standardization might be at a greater cost than you want to pay. Now, with regard to the least developed countries, the small projects and this type of thing, I think that one reflection could be that there needs to be more specialization of the international financial institutions, of organizations like the GCF and JEF and others, the Adaptation Fund, to specialize in these cases and not to be involved in projects that perfectly well could have financing of another type. And for example, I'm on the GCF board, and we've had several cases there where the GCF is blended in as a cost reduction mechanism, really. And so I think that those things should be revised, and the special attention should be given to the LDSs and the smaller projects. But I think that here also there is a matter of really getting into guarantee funds. Maybe one of the things these institutions should do is to get into the guarantee funds, which charge for the guarantee so they can be rotating, and revolving funds. And that could be a solution to many of these cases. So it's a change of focus instead of directly financing, but rather to guarantee the projects of LDC, of least developed countries, and these small projects and others. The question I have is, I would be interested in knowing what was the tenor of the discussion of resilience versus adaptation?
Okay, are there any other, we could try to take, we could group 2 or 3 questions together, if there are any others at the moment. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for the good presentations. I do have a comment on the issue of policies and enabling environment for mobilization of climate finance. I think I do agree that the issues of coordination between institutions at the different levels, regional, national, and local, are really very important, and issues of mainstreaming and enhancing the enabling environment is very important. However, I see it as very important also. It is also important to talk about enabling environment for accessing climate finance. And I would like really to flag that for low-income countries, the national level does really represent a potential source for mobilization of climate finance for implementation of climate resilient infrastructure. Thinking just about the estimation that were indicated this morning, the 100 trillions of US dollars between here and 2030. I don't think we could, as low-income countries, we could secure any amount of that, because the national government currently are struggling with extreme event and are struggling with securing urgent and immediate needs. So this is what I really wanted to flag. Thank you.
Thanks. Is there one more question? Otherwise, we could take these two right now and come back later. Okay, let's take these two for now. So I think Paul's first, I think there were a couple reflections that Paul shared around standardization, and then also wanted to hear more about the conversation on resilience versus adaptation. So I know that came up in my group. I won't personally try to answer the question, but I can put someone else on the spot who raised it. But I think it came up in a number of other groups as well. If anyone wants to comment on either one of those, the standardization and resilience versus adaptation. And the second question, which I think is really an excellent one, which is particularly in the LDC or low-income countries context. We've spoken about major trillions of dollars in assets floating out around there in the global financial architecture. What in particular, and I think it's good that we have some co-facilitators from the World Bank and Jeff here, what in particular are your institutions doing to, or that you're aware of in the public financial institution space to connect and help developing countries access those resources, if it's pioneering, particular in financing vehicles like green bonds, which I know the World Bank has done, or anything else in that space.
I'll give you some time to think about that last question. But no, well, in our group, which was on planning, we did talk about adaptation versus resilience. We didn't talk about it as adaptation versus resilience, but we talked about sort of the relation, and that resilience has a broader implication as well, but also that it doesn't make sense to only plan for adaptation, and at the same time plan for development, and at the same time plan for disaster risk reduction, but that all these issues go together, and that they need to be seen as one package. So that also the strategic planning need to focus more on integrating all these issues, and not single out, I think, adaptation as one thing that we need to plan for, but see adaptation as part of the larger development planning. And that resilience, also includes, it's not only infrastructure that we need to focus on, but also on education, on the broader capacity building, and that together builds resilience. I mean, so no definitional issues, is there, but the broader context.
Sure. I'll try to touch a bit on resilience and adaptation. We didn't talk about resilience versus adaptation, but an interesting point came up, resilience versus development. And the requirements or the definition differences between the two that actually causes difficulties in accessing funds. How far mainstreaming is encouraged, at the same time it's completely mainstream, then it becomes development. Then that additional cost of financing adaptation, the countries are finding it difficult to to quantify. So resilience versus development was something that we talked about in our teams. On standardization, there's nothing really I have some to respond to. I just want to acknowledge that in all our groups, we did discuss the both ends, both sides of the coins for standardization. In one point, it would provide some clarity on how to do resilience. There are the clear guidances. But the other point was, like I said, it will add the burden. But really the trick is, I think somebody also mentioned in our teams, the differentiation between principles of resilience versus standards that are much more stringent. And principles will probably allow us to make it more locally specific and contextualized guidance versus all countries have to have really standard, stringent guidance standards on what climate resilient infrastructure would mean. And on how to, third point on how to access financing, how is World Bank in general is helping countries access climate finance. I'll try to answer because it's so broad. We're trying to build capacity in the countries, first of all, in, like you mentioned, green bonds. I'm not specifically involved in that, but we have mobilized a lot of technicals, DPLs, the policy lending instruments, as well as investments to facilitate in different countries the capacity as well as investments in these areas. Second, I also think the initiative within the World Bank on NDC Partner Support Facility that's helping countries translate what does these NDC targets mean, both adaptation and mitigation, how can we implement them so that countries can actually meet these targets. That is done with the intention that the countries will be able to unlock the financing once the financing that's tied to the NDC target requirements. The third point that comes to my mind is a number of projects that the World Bank is investing in, and also the stringent requirements that we ourselves have put in, just like IDA requirements for climate screening, and helping countries actually meet those requirements. That will facilitate and support countries understand what does climate change actually, in terms of project design and implementation, what does it mean by implementing and being involved in this entire value chain of project design, screening, finding what the issue is, being involved in the project design, and integrating resilience measures in these designs, and sharing that knowledge so that it's available to countries at large. So this is 3 different levels, from knowledge, investment, tools, and sharing, that the bank in general is trying to support unlocking the finance that is available.
Thanks in particular for such I think a well-rounded answer for being randomly put on the spot on that question. I know was not part of your reporting back on your breakout group, so thanks for that.
I think Paul, with a lot of experience, can add something here.
Well, this is not the occasion to really get a good debate going, but I think we could. And I would argue for integration. I don't think we can have a development plan and an adaptation plan and a disaster plan. We don't have the resources for that. We need synergies. We need them all together. And it makes sense for them to be all together too. And so where we have these high synergy options is the best possible place to put our money and our effort. So if, in the example I gave earlier, if we can do reforestation of degraded lands, and so it's mitigation because you're capturing CO2e, it's adaptation because you're stopping the fast runoff that leads to flooding and that can lead into mudslides. You're doing this with small and medium-sized producers with things like teak and mahogany, coffee, cacao. It's livelihoods, so it's development at the same time. So if you can get those combinations, I think it's the best way to go. And with regard to the disaster people, they have to study what the vulnerabilities are. And if we're going to look for climate resilient infrastructure, we have to know what are the vulnerabilities and what are the risks involved in them. So that's very valuable integration into the same team. And a lot of climate resilient is location, which the change in location might have a marginal increase in costs, but it's not cost intensive, it's brain intensive. The no-brainers like Tokyo Power might have learned not to put a nuclear power plant on an earthquake-prone coast. That's one. Or after the bridge has been knocked down twice, you might think this is not the best place for the bridge. That it's not the shortest distance between 2 points, but the shortest sustainable distance between 2 points is where the bridge should go. So I think to have integrated teams, I would argue for that. And maybe someday we could debate that with those who have other views.